My house was destroyed by a devastating fire. At 65, I went to seek refuge at my son's place, but he turned me away, claiming his fiancée needed privacy. Desperate, I called my first love, a man I hadn't seen in 4 decades. When he opened the door to his mansion, he spoke just 3 words. "You finally came home." My life was changed forever. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love to know how far our stories travel. My name is Grace, and at 65 years old, I thought I had already experienced every kind of suffering life could throw at me. I was wrong. It all started on a Wednesday that seemed just like any other in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was in the kitchen fixing my afternoon coffee when I smelled something strange. I decided to check, thinking maybe I'd left something on the stove. When I opened the living room door, I was met by a wall of smoke so thick I could barely see through it. Flames were already consuming the curtains and racing up the walls with a speed that left me paralyzed for a few crucial seconds. The smoke detector should have been screaming, but I found out later. The battery had died months ago. A simple oversight that would cost me everything I owned. I ran back to the kitchen, fumbling for the phone to call the fire department. But the smoke was everywhere, making it hard to breathe. Impossible to think straight. I heard glass breaking and realized I had no time. The flames were eating my house, with a ferocious hunger that seemed impossible to contain. My only thought was to get out alive. I grabbed my purse, which was on the kitchen table, and bolted for the back door. The last thing I saw before I burst outside was the portrait of Robert, my late husband, starting to blacken from the heat. The neighbors were already in the street. When I stumbled out, coughing and gasping, Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, was the first to rush over, hugging me as we both watched helplessly while the fire devoured the home where I'd lived for over 40 years. The fire department arrived in 10 minutes, but it was already too late. They managed to keep the blaze from spreading to neighboring houses, but mine was beyond salvation. In just 1 hour, 4 decades of memories were reduced to ashes. The kitchen table, where David used to do his homework, the walls that held the marks of my son's growth, the bedroom I shared with Robert. For 37 years, it was all gone. I stood on the sidewalk wrapped in a blanket someone had put around my shoulders while the firefighters did their work. Later, they would tell me it was likely a short circuit in an old living room outlet, a simple electrical problem that turned my life into ruins. The flames finally subsided, leaving behind only a blackened smoking structure. The fire chief approached me, his face smeared with soot, his eyes full of a pity I couldn't bear in that moment. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We did everything we could," but he didn't need to finish the sentence. I could see it for myself. A total loss. Everything I possessed, besides the clothes on my back and the contents of my purse, had vanished. The neighbors, who were lucky enough to still have homes, took me in for the first night. Sweet Mrs. Jenkins insisted I stay with her, but her small apartment was already crowded with visiting grandchildren. The American Red Cross had set up emergency shelters, but the thought of sleeping in a gymnasium full of strangers made me feel even more lost. That's when I knew I had to call David. My son lives about a 40-minute drive away in Valentine, a posh Charlotte suburb with tree-lined streets and houses that look lifted straight out of a magazine. He moved there 4 years ago when he was promoted to regional manager at the insurance company where he works. We weren't close, not the way mothers and sons should be, but he was all the family I had left. I used Mrs. Jennings' phone because mine had melted, along with everything else. "David, darling, it's Mom," I said, my voice weaker than I intended. "Mom, what's going on? You sound upset." "There was a fire, son. The house is gone. Everything's gone." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Were you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. Just a few scrapes and a scratchy throat from the smoke. But I need a place to stay while I figure things out. Just temporarily." Another pause. "Sure, Mom. Come on over. We'll work it out." The relief that washed over me was so intense I nearly collapsed. My son would take care of me. Despite all our distance, all the missed calls and awkward holiday dinners, he was still my boy. I spent the next morning staring at the charred ruins, waiting for the insurance adjuster to arrive. He showed up promptly at 9. A young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, surveying what was left of my home with a clipboard and a camera. Total loss, he said pragmatically, as if those two words didn't represent my entire life. How much? I asked, although I dreaded hearing the answer. Well, you had a policy of about $200,000 on the structure, but with your deductible and depreciation, we're talking maybe $90,000. Maybe less. $90,000 to rebuild 42 years of life. It seemed impossible. Mrs. Jenkins helped me buy some basic clothes and toiletries with the emergency money the Red Cross had given me. Everything I now owned fit into one small borrowed suitcase. That was it. It was all I had left of the life I'd built. The drive to David's house felt like a journey to a foreign country. Everything looks different when you have nowhere to go back to. Familiar places, the gas station where I always bought my lottery, tickets, the diner where Robert and I used to have Sunday breakfast, all seemed to belong to someone else's life. Now David's neighborhood was immaculate as always. Perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect lives continuing exactly as they had the day before. I felt like an intruder, bringing my tragedy into their spotless world. His house was a two-story colonial with white shutters and a red door that Victoria, his fiancée, had chosen. I'd met her exactly 3 times in the 2 years they'd been together. She was 30, and he was 39. She worked at a downtown marketing firm and had an opinion on everything from the color of the walls to the type of wine to serve at dinner. I pulled the cab into their driveway and sat still for a moment, gathering my courage. This is temporary, I told myself. Just until I can figure out what comes next. Just until the insurance money comes in and I can find a small apartment somewhere. I never imagined that walking up to my son's front door with my little borrowed suitcase would be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But as I raised my hand to knock, I felt a familiar sinking feeling. The same hollow feeling I got when Robert died, as if the floor were disappearing beneath my feet. I just didn't know yet how much deeper I was about to fall. David opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been watching for me. For one moment, seeing his familiar face, Robert's eyes, my own stubborn chin, made me feel like everything might be okay. He was my son, my only child. Surely blood meant something. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in, but his voice held something I couldn't quite place. Distance maybe, or discomfort. Victoria appeared behind him almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting in the wings. She wore white jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than I used to spend on a month's worth of groceries. Her brown hair was pulled back into one of those messy buns that somehow looked perfectly styled, and her smile was the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Grace, how horrible about your house," she said, but she was looking at my ragged suitcase, not me. David told me what happened. I put my suitcase down in their pristine entryway, suddenly conscious of how I must look. My newly bought clothes, cheap and simple, seemed out of place against the polished marble of the hall. I could still smell the smoke clinging to my hair, despite the shower I'd taken at Mrs. Jenkins' house. "It's just temporary," I said quickly, "just until I can get back on my feet." David and Victoria exchanged a glance. One of those wordless spousal conversations that excludes everyone else in the room. I'd seen Robert and I do the same thing countless times, but from the outside, it felt like they were shutting me out of a club I didn't know existed. "Let's sit down and talk," David said, guiding me into the living room. Their house was beautiful in the way magazine houses are beautiful. Everything matched. Nothing was out of place. White furniture that looked like no one had ever actually sat on it. Glass coffee tables that reflected the light from windows so clean they looked invisible. It was the kind of house you were afraid to touch anything in. I sat on the edge of the immaculate sofa, my new shoes firmly planted on the flawless hardwood floors. Victoria noticed and flinched slightly. "So what's the plan?" David asked, settling into the armchair across from me, not next to me on the sofa where he could have put his arm around his distraught mother, but opposite me, as if we were conducting business. "Well, the insurance adjuster said it'll take a few weeks to process everything, maybe a month. I was hoping I could stay here until then, just until I find a small apartment or something." The silence that followed stretched about 10 seconds longer than it should have. I watched Victoria's face change. I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She leaned over and placed her hand on David's arm, a gesture that looked supportive, but was clearly possessive. "Mom," David began, and I knew from his tone that what was coming next would break my heart. "The thing is, Victoria and I have been talking, and we really value our privacy here. We work long hours, and this is our sanctuary, if you know what I mean." I blinked, not quite comprehending. "I wouldn't be in your way. I'd keep to myself. I'll help with cooking, cleaning. I won't be a bother." Victoria leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "It's not about being a bother, Grace. It's about space. This house is our first home together, and we're still finding our rhythm as a couple." "I'm his mother," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "Of course you are," Victoria replied smoothly. "And that's why we thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, somewhere. You can have your independence while you rebuild." I looked at David, expecting him to contradict her, to remember that I was the woman who had stayed up with him through every fever, who had worked double shifts to pay for his college books, who had held his hand through his divorce 3 years ago when his ex-wife left him for her personal trainer. Instead, he nodded. "Victoria's right. Mom, we think you'd be happier with your own space." The words hit me like a physical punch. I actually felt my chest constrict as if someone were squeezing my lungs. "Happier, David? I lost everything yesterday. Everything. And you think I'd be happier alone in a hotel room than here with my family?" "It doesn't have to be a hotel," Victoria said quickly. "There are some lovely extended stay places near the mall, very clean, very safe, and they have little kitchenettes so you can cook for yourself." I stared at this woman who had only been in my son's life for 2 years, telling me where I should live after losing my home. And how am I supposed to pay for this lovely extended stay place? The insurance money won't arrive for weeks. David shifted uncomfortably. "I could help out with that. A few $100 to get you started." "A few $100? As if I were a distant relative he barely knew, not the woman who gave him life. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in years." "It's nothing fancy," I protested. But inside I glowed. When was the last time anyone had truly appreciated my cooking? David used to complain that I made the same 5 dishes over and over. Victoria once suggested I try more contemporary flavors for family dinners. Randall shook his head. "It's perfect. You're perfect." That word perfect should have made me uneasy. I was 65 with gray roots showing and expression lines that had become permanent grooves. My hands were spotted with age, my body soft in places that used to be firm. I was anything but perfect. But when Randall looked at me, I saw myself reflected in his eyes as someone beautiful, someone worthy of love and attention and gentle care. We fell into routines that felt as natural as breathing. We ate breakfast together on the back porch where Randall read business reports, and I watched the birds at his elaborate feeders. We took afternoon walks around the property, where he showed me the gardens he'd planted himself and the greenhouse where he grew orchids as a hobby. The evenings were for talking. We had 40 years to catch up on, and we did it slowly, carefully, like archaeologists examining precious artifacts. I told him how hard it had been to lose Robert, about the emptiness of the house in the months afterward, about how I had to force myself out of bed every morning, about the loneliness of widowhood, the way people treat you like half a person once. "Your husband is gone." He told me about his business, how it had grown from a small construction company to a development empire with projects in 3 states, about the women he dated over the years, smart, accomplished. Women who looked perfect next to him at charity galas, but who never made him feel whole. "There was one woman," he said. "One night as we sat near his fireplace, the rain drumming against the windows. Elena, she was an architect, brilliant, beautiful. Everyone said we were perfect for each other. I felt a pang of jealousy that surprised me with its intensity. What happened? I proposed," he said quietly. "On Christmas Eve 5 years ago, big show, restaurant overlooking the city, expensive ring, everything she said she wanted, and she said yes. We planned the wedding for the following summer. But as the date got closer, I kept having this feeling that something was wrong. Not with her. She was everything anyone could want in a wife. But with me." He paused, staring into the fire. "The night before the wedding, I called it off." "Randall, no. What did you tell her?" "The truth." He looked at me, his eyes serious. "That I was still in love with a woman I'd met 40 years ago. And it wouldn't be fair to marry her while my heart belonged to someone else." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You canceled your wedding for me. For the memory of me, for the possibility that someday, somehow, I might need you. And you would be here waiting. I looked at this successful, handsome man who could have had anyone, and tried to process what he was telling me. This is crazy, I said. It is. He leaned forward, taking my hands in his. It's crazier that you kept my business card in your wallet for 40 years. He was right. Sure, we were both crazy. We were both living with the ghosts of what might have been. But somehow, against all odds, our particular brand of crazy had brought us back together. 3 weeks after my arrival, David called. I was in Randall's kitchen making dinner and humming to myself. Actually humming something I hadn't done in years when my phone rang. David's name on the screen made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Hello, dear," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Mom," his tone was odd, carefully controlled. "I've been trying to call you. Your phone keeps going straight to voicemail." That was true. I'd been screening my calls, not ready to deal with whatever guilt or obligation David might try to impose on me. "I've been busy." "Busy doing what?" "I heard you checked out of the hotel weeks ago. Where are you living?" I looked around Randall's beautiful kitchen, at the fresh flowers he'd brought home that morning, at the expensive wine glasses on the counter. "I'm staying with a friend." "What friend?" "Mom, you don't have friends with money?" His assumption offended me, partly because it had been true for so long after Robert died. I'd let most of my friendships fade, too tired and too proud to maintain relationships when I had nothing to offer in return. "Would you be surprised?" I said coldly. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him processing this information. "Mom, I think we need to talk. Victoria and I have been discussing the situation, and we think maybe we were too hasty. Maybe you could stay in our guest room for a while, just until you get back on your feet." The offer that would have meant everything to me a month ago now felt hollow, insulting even. "What made you change your mind?" Another pause. We realized that maybe we were too focused on our own needs. Family needs to stick together. What he meant, I realized, was that he'd probably heard through the neighborhood gossip network that his mother was no longer staying in a cheap hotel. Someone had mentioned seeing her with a well-dressed man in a nice car. David was curious, and curiosity had made him generous. "That's very kind of you," I said, "but I'm perfectly happy where I am." "Mom, you can't just move in with a stranger. It's not safe. What do you even know about this person?" "I know. He's never made me feel like a burden," I said quietly. "I know he values my company and appreciates my cooking, and he tells me I'm beautiful every single day. The wedding wasn't like my first one. When I married Robert 40 years ago, it was all about what everyone else expected. White dress, church ceremony, reception at the community center with a DJ and a cash bar. We invited everyone we knew and several people we didn't particularly like, because that's what you did. We performed the ritual for the community, not for ourselves. This time, Randall and I did exactly what we wanted. The ceremony took place in his backyard on a crisp November morning, 5 months after that phone call in the hotel. The pastor was an old friend of Randall's, and the only witnesses were Maria, the housekeeper, and Marcus, Randall's business partner and best friend of 25 years. I wore a simple blue dress that Randall said matched my eyes, and he wore a gray suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. No fuss, no fanfare, no stress of impressing anyone. Just two people who had found each other again after 4 decades, promising to spend whatever time they had left together. David came to the wedding. I had debated whether to even invite him, but Randall convinced me to try one more time. "He's your son," he said simply. "You'll regret it if you don't give him a chance to make it right." So, I called him 2 weeks before the ceremony. "Randall and I are getting married," I said flatly. "November 15th at 2 o'clock. You're welcome to come, but Victoria is not invited." He showed up alone, looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. He shook Randall's hand politely. He made polite small talk and even managed a strange smile when the pastor declared us husband and wife. But I could see the calculation in his eyes. The way he took inventory of Randall's house, his car, the obvious markers of wealth. This morning, I woke up in Randall's arms, in my husband's arms, in the room that became ours, in the house that became our home. Sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the gardens we tend together, and I could smell the coffee Randall makes every morning before I wake up. At 66, I am happier than I've ever been. Not because of Randall's money or his beautiful house or his success, but because someone sees me, truly sees me, and chooses to love what he sees. The fire took my old life. It consumed it and turned it to ash. But sometimes I think, as I watch Randall read his morning paper across the breakfast table, destruction is just another word for renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find, everything you truly needed. And sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, first love gets a second chance to become forever love. The business card I kept for 40 years is framed now, sitting on Randall's desk in his home office. A reminder that some promises are worth keeping, even when it takes 4 decades to deliver on them. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.